The history of penicillin, the accidental discovery that saved millions, sleepy history. Good evening, and welcome to Boring History to Sleep. Tonight, we are going to talk about a discovery that, perhaps more than any other in the 20th century, redrew the boundaries between life and death. We will tell the story of penicillin, the world's first true antibiotic. It is a story not of a single flash of genius, but of quiet observation, dogged persistence, and incredible, world-changing luck. It is a tale that begins in a world where a simple scratch from a rose thorn could be a death sentence, and ends in an age where deadly infections could be vanquished by a simple injection. Penicillin didn't just cure diseases, it changed the very nature of medicine, making possible everything from complex surgeries to organ transplants. Before we journey back to a time before this miracle, we'd love to know where you are listening from this evening. What part of the world are you in, and what can you hear outside your window as you settle in? Let us know in the comments. Now, take a slow, deep breath. Let go of the tensions of the day. Feel the comfort of your surroundings. Our story begins not with a discovery, but with a world that was desperately waiting for one. A world where the greatest enemy of humankind was not visible to the naked eye. Chapter 1. The World Before the Miracle. To truly understand the monumental impact of penicillin, we must first immerse ourselves in the world that existed before it. We must peel back the layers of modern medical certainty and step into a time, not so very long ago, when humanity was locked in a constant and often losing battle against an invisible enemy. This was a world defined by the terror of infection. In the early 20th century, and for all of human history prior, the greatest threats to life were not chronic illnesses like heart disease or cancer, but the swift, merciless onslaught of bacteria. A simple cut from a kitchen knife, a scrape on a child's knee, a nick from a shaving razor. Any breach in the body's natural defenses could open the door to a fatal infection. Bacteria, omnipresent and unseen, would invade the wound, multiplying with terrifying speed, leading to agonizing pain, raging fevers, and the systemic poisoning of the blood known as septicemia. Imagine the surgical wards of the great hospitals of London, Paris, or New York in the years before World War II. Even with the advances of anesthesia and a growing understanding of hygiene, surgery remained a terrifying gamble. The primary challenge was not the operation itself, but the almost inevitable infection that followed. Surgeons, even the most skilled, knew that a significant percentage of their patients would survive the knife only to die days later from what was called ward fever or hospital gangrene. The wards were filled with the sick, sweet smell of infected flesh, and the concept of a routine, safe operation did not exist. For mothers, childbirth was a perilous journey. Puerperal fever, a bacterial infection of the uterus after giving birth, was a common and terrifying scourge, turning the miracle of birth into a tragedy, leaving behind grieving husbands and motherless infants. Diseases that we now consider minor inconveniences were killers. A sore throat could escalate into rheumatic fever, damaging the heart valves. An earache could lead to meningitis, an inflammation of the brain and spinal cord. And pneumonia, an infection of the lungs, was so frequently fatal, especially for the old and the young, that it was known as the old man's friend, a grim euphemism for a common and expected way to die. The battlefields of the First World War, from 1914 to 1918, provided the most horrific testament to this reality. More soldiers died from infected wounds than from the direct impact of bullets and shells. A soldier might survive the initial blast of an explosion, only to have the dirt and fragments of his uniform ground into the wound. In the muddy, bacteria-rich trenches, these wounds would almost invariably become infected. The result was gas gangrene, a gruesome condition where bacteria devoured muscle tissue, producing gas and a foul-smelling decay. The only treatment was amputation, the desperate, brutal act of sawing off a limb in the hope of stopping the infection's spread. The medical tents were filled with young men whose lives were forever altered by the loss of an arm or a leg, all because of a bacterial infection that doctors were powerless to stop. The medical toolkit of the time was tragically limited. Doctors could clean wounds, they could drain abscesses, and they could hope. They had antiseptics, chemicals like carbolic acid and iodine, but these were a double-edged sword. While they could kill bacteria on the surface of a wound, they were also toxic to human tissue, often damaging the body's own white blood cells, the very soldiers of the immune system, thereby hindering the natural healing process. What medicine desperately needed was a magic bullet, a substance that could seek out and destroy invading bacteria inside the human body without harming the patient's own cells. It was a fantasy, a dream of medical science. No one truly believed such a substance could exist. This was the world that was waiting, unknowingly, for a moment of chance in a cluttered London laboratory. A world where life was fragile and death by infection was an everyday, accepted reality. Chapter 2. Discovering the Unseen Enemy. Humanity could not begin to fight its invisible microbial foes until it first knew that they existed. The story of penicillin is built upon a foundation laid by centuries of painstaking scientific inquiry that first revealed the hidden world of microorganisms. For most of history, the causes of disease were a mystery, attributed to divine punishment, evil spirits, or imbalances in the body's humors. The idea that tiny living creatures could be responsible for sickness was unimaginable. The first crack in this wall of ignorance came in the 17th century, in the Dutch city of Delft. A draper and haberdasher named Antony van Leeuwenhoek, a man with no formal scientific training but with an obsessive curiosity and an unmatched talent for grinding small, powerful lenses, created the world's first truly effective microscopes. He turned his lenses on everything he could find: a drop of pond water, the plaque scraped from his own teeth, a sample of his blood. What he saw astonished him. He discovered a teeming, vibrant world of what he called animalcules, tiny, swimming, writhing creatures, 1,000 times smaller than anything seen before. He was the first human to witness bacteria and protozoa. He documented his findings in detailed letters to the Royal Society in London, but for nearly 200 years, his discovery remained a curiosity, a novelty with no understood connection to human health. The crucial link between these animalcules and disease would not be forged until the mid-19th century, during a golden age of scientific discovery in Europe. The two giants of this era were the French chemist Louis Pasteur and the German physician Robert Koch. Pasteur, initially working to solve problems for the French wine and silk industries, proved that the processes of fermentation and spoilage were not spontaneous chemical events, but were caused by living microorganisms. He demonstrated that by heating a liquid, a process he called pasteurization. These microbes could be killed, preventing the liquid from souring. He then turned his attention to disease. In a series of brilliant and elegant experiments, most famously using swan-necked flasks that allowed air in but trapped dust-borne microbes, he demolished the long-held theory of spontaneous generation and proved that life only comes from pre-existing life. This led him to propose the groundbreaking germ theory of disease. The idea that infectious diseases are caused by the invasion of the body by specific microorganisms. While Pasteur established the theory, Robert Koch provided the rigorous methodology to prove it. As a country doctor in Germany, Koch became obsessed with anthrax, a disease that was devastating local livestock. Working in a makeshift laboratory in his home, he painstakingly isolated the bacterium responsible for the disease, Bacillus anthracis. He grew it in a pure culture outside the body, then injected it into healthy mice, which then developed anthrax. He then re-isolated the same bacterium from the newly diseased mice, proving its role as the causative agent. This methodical approach became known as Koch's postulates, a set of 4 criteria that became the gold standard for identifying the specific microbe responsible for a specific disease. Using this method, Koch and his students went on to identify the bacteria responsible for tuberculosis and cholera, 2 of the greatest killers of the 19th century. The work of Pasteur and Koch was a revolution. The invisible enemy now had a face. Disease was no longer a metaphysical mystery but a biological process, a battle between a host and a specific identifiable invader. This new knowledge opened the door to new strategies for fighting disease. Public health measures like sanitation and water purification, the development of vaccines, and the search for ways to kill the germs themselves. The stage was now set for the next chapter, the hunt for a weapon to use in this newly declared war. Chapter 3. The first shots fired, antiseptics and magic bullets. With the acceptance of the germ theory of disease, the medical world was armed with a powerful new understanding. But it was still fighting a war with primitive weapons. Knowing that bacteria caused infection was one thing. Knowing how to stop them once they were inside the human body was another entirely. The first major practical application of the germ theory came in the operating theater, through the work of a British surgeon named Joseph Lister. Appalled by the high rates of post-operative mortality from hospital gangrene, Lister read Pasteur's work and theorized that the infections were caused by microbes entering the wounds from the air and from the surgeon's hands and instruments. He began experimenting with carbolic acid, a chemical known to kill bacteria in sewage. In 1865, he started spraying a fine mist of carbolic acid over the patient, the surgeon's hands, and the instruments throughout the entire operation. He also used it to dress the wounds afterwards. The results were astonishing. The rates of infection and death on his ward plummeted. Lister's method of antiseptic surgery was a monumental step forward, transforming surgery from a near-certain death sentence into a viable therapeutic practice. However, Lister's method had a significant drawback. Carbolic acid was a blunt instrument. It was caustic and toxic, killing not only the bacteria but also damaging the patient's own tissues in the surgeon's hands. It was an external weapon, useful for preventing germs from getting in, but it could not be taken internally to fight an infection that had already taken hold. The dream of an internal antiseptic, a magic bullet that would hunt down and destroy pathogens within the body while leaving the host's cells unharmed, was most famously articulated and pursued by a brilliant and tenacious German scientist named Paul Ehrlich. Ehrlich was a pioneer in the fields of hematology and immunology, and he became fascinated with the way certain dyes would selectively stain specific cells or bacteria and not others. This, he reasoned, meant that it should be possible to create a chemical compound that would selectively bind to and kill a specific type of invading microbe. He spent years in a painstaking process of chemotherapy, the term he coined, systematically creating and testing hundreds of chemical compounds against different diseases. His primary target was syphilis, a devastating and widespread sexually transmitted disease caused by the spirochete bacterium Treponema pallidum. The only existing treatment was mercury, a highly toxic poison that often caused more harm than the disease itself. Ehrlich and his team decided to focus on arsenic-based compounds. They synthesized and tested one compound after another, in a process of methodical and often disheartening trial and error. The first 605 compounds failed, but in 1909, his new colleague Sahachiro Hata retested compound number 606. It proved to be remarkably effective against the syphilis spirochete in rabbits. After successful human trials, the drug was released in 1910 under the trade name Salvarsan. It was the first truly effective treatment for syphilis and the world's first modern chemotherapeutic agent. Salvarsan was hailed as a miracle, and Ehrlich became a global celebrity. His magic bullet concept was proven to be possible. However, Salvarsan was not a perfect drug. It was an arsenic compound and still had significant toxic side effects. It had to be administered intravenously through a difficult and painful procedure, and it was only effective against a very specific type of bacterium. It did not work against the common bacteria that cause the majority of wound infections and diseases like pneumonia and strep throat, the Staphylococci and Streptococci. Despite these limitations, the work of Lister and Ehrlich was profoundly important. They showed that the war against germs could be fought with chemical weapons. They established the foundational principles of antisepsis and chemotherapy. But the war was still being fought with cannons when what was needed was a guided missile. The world was still waiting for a substance that was both broad in its effectiveness and gentle on the body. The stage was set, the scientific principles were in place, and all that was needed was the right person, in the right place, at the right time, to notice something that others might have overlooked. Chapter 4. Alexander Fleming, the man behind the myth. The man who would make that pivotal observation was not a methodical chemist like Ehrlich, but a bacteriologist from Scotland with a sharp mind, a keen eye, and a notoriously untidy laboratory. His name was Alexander Fleming. Born in 1881 on a remote farm in Ayrshire, Scotland, Fleming's early life was simple and rural. He developed a deep appreciation for the natural world and a habit of careful observation. After a brief career as a shipping clerk in London, a small inheritance allowed him to follow his brother into the medical profession. He enrolled at St. Mary's Hospital Medical School in Paddington, London, where he would, remarkably, spend his entire professional career. Fleming was a brilliant student, but he was not initially drawn to research. He intended to become a surgeon. His path changed when he joined the Rifle Club at St. Mary's. The captain of the club, a prominent bacteriologist named Sir Almroth Wright, was eager to keep the talented marksman on his team and at the hospital, so he offered Fleming a position in his research department, known as the inoculation department. Fleming accepted, and the world of medicine was forever changed. Wright's department was at the forefront of the new field of immunology, developing vaccines and studying the body's natural defenses against infection. Fleming became a skilled and respected bacteriologist. But his career, like that of so many of his generation, was interrupted by the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. He served as a captain in the Royal Army Medical Corps, working in a battlefield hospital in Boulogne, France. There, he witnessed firsthand the horrific reality of bacterial infection. He saw countless soldiers die from infected wounds, their bodies overwhelmed by septicemia and gangrene. He and his mentor, Wright, studied the wounds and the treatments being used. They came to a crucial and counterintuitive conclusion. The standard antiseptic treatments of the day, such as carbolic acid, were often doing more harm than good. They conducted experiments showing that while these harsh chemicals could kill bacteria in a test tube, when applied to a deep, dirty wound, they also killed the body's own protective white blood cells, effectively destroying the natural immune response and creating a better environment for the bacteria to thrive in the dead tissue. Fleming became convinced that what was needed was not a chemical that killed the body's defenses, but something that could work with them. After the war, Fleming returned to his laboratory at St. Mary's. His research now focused on finding a natural antibacterial agent. He had a minor success in 1922 when he discovered an enzyme he named lysozyme. He found it in various bodily fluids, such as tears, saliva, and mucus. He discovered it when a drop of mucus from his own running nose fell into a petri dish of bacteria, and he later observed that the bacteria in that spot had been dissolved. Lysozyme was a fascinating discovery, a key part of the body's innate immune system, but it proved to be a disappointment as a therapeutic agent. It was effective only against a small number of harmless bacteria and had no effect on the dangerous pathogens that caused most human diseases. For the next several years, Fleming continued his work as a bacteriologist, teaching, researching, and publishing papers on Staphylococcus, a common and dangerous group of bacteria responsible for everything from boils and abscesses to fatal blood poisoning. He was known among his colleagues as a brilliant researcher, but also as someone who was famously disorganized. His laboratory bench was a chaotic jumble of old petri dishes, test tubes, and glass plates. It was this very untidiness, a trait that would have been frowned upon in a more disciplined German laboratory, that would set the stage for one of the greatest accidental discoveries in the history of science. Chapter 5. The Fortunate Accident. The story of the discovery of penicillin has become a modern legend, a perfect parable of scientific serendipity. The event itself took place in the late summer of 1928, in Alexander Fleming's small cluttered laboratory on the second floor of St. Mary's Hospital. As was his custom, Fleming had taken the month of August off for a holiday with his family. Before he left, in his typically haphazard fashion, he had stacked a number of petri dishes he had been using to grow Staphylococcus bacteria on a bench in a corner of the lab, leaving them to be cleaned up upon his return. When he came back to the lab on the morning of September 3, 1928, he began the task of sorting through the old cultures. He was showing his work to a visiting colleague, Dr. Merlin Price, when he picked up one particular dish from the pile. He paused and looked at it more closely. "That's funny," he remarked, a phrase that would echo through the history of science. What Fleming had noticed was something unusual. The petri dish had been contaminated with a mold, a bluish-green fungus, which was not uncommon in the damp London air. But what was remarkable was what was happening around the mold. Everywhere else on the dish, the Staphylococcus had grown into opaque, creamy yellow colonies, as expected. But in a wide, clear circle surrounding the invading mold, the bacteria had vanished. The colonies were either dead or had failed to grow at all. It looked as though the mold was producing some kind of substance that was leaking out into the agar jelly and killing the powerful Staphylococcus bacteria. Many other scientists might have simply discarded the contaminated plate as a failed experiment and moved on. But Fleming, with his wartime experience and his long search for a natural antibacterial agent, immediately recognized the potential significance of what he was seeing. His mind, prepared by years of research, was ready to understand the meaning of this accident. He carefully took a sample of the mold and began to cultivate it in a broth. He then took the broth, filtered out the mold itself, and found that this mold juice, as he initially called it, was incredibly potent. Even when diluted up to 800 times, it was capable of preventing the growth of Staphylococcus. A series of fortunate coincidences had to align perfectly for this discovery to happen. First, Fleming had to be messy, leaving his plates out instead of immediately sterilizing them. Second, a spore of a specific type of mold, later identified as Penicillium notatum, had to drift in through the open window, likely from a mycology lab on the floor below. Third, the weather in London that August had to be unusual. There was a cool spell shortly after Fleming left, which allowed the mold to grow before the bacteria. Then a heat wave hit, which encouraged the bacteria to grow, except in the area where the mold had already established itself and was producing its antibacterial substance. If the weather had been consistently warm, the bacteria would have overgrown the mold before it had a chance to produce anything. If it had been consistently cool, neither would have grown sufficiently. The specific sequence of events was so improbable that it seems almost miraculous. Fleming had found something far more powerful than the antiseptics he had decried during the war. Here was a substance that was lethal to bacteria. Yet, when he tested it on white blood cells in lab animals, it appeared to be completely harmless to them. This was it. This was the magic bullet he had been looking for. A natural substance that could attack the invader without harming the host. The messy bacteriologist, through a combination of chance, observation, and a prepared mind, had stumbled upon a key that had the potential to unlock a new era in medicine. Chapter 6. Mold Juice. The Frustrating Pursuit. Discovering the phenomenon was one thing. Harnessing it was another entirely. The clear zone on the petri dish was a tantalizing promise, but turning that promise into a practical medicine would prove to be a monumental challenge. One that Alexander Fleming, for all his brilliance as a bacteriologist, was not equipped to solve. He began a series of experiments to explore the properties of his mold juice, which he would later formally name penicillin, in a scientific paper published in 1929. He confirmed his initial observations with painstaking work. He grew the Penicillium notatum mold in a liquid broth, and then tested its effects on a wide variety of bacteria. He found that it was remarkably effective against many of the most common causes of human disease, the so-called gram-positive bacteria, which included the Staphylococci, Streptococci, the cause of strep throat and scarlet fever, and pneumococci, the cause of pneumonia. However, he also found that it was ineffective against other types of bacteria, such as the gram-negative bacterium that caused typhoid fever. This selectivity was actually useful in the lab. He could add penicillin to a mixed culture to kill off the susceptible bacteria, making it easier to isolate the resistant ones. His most exciting finding was that penicillin appeared to be non-toxic. He injected large doses of his crude extract into mice and rabbits, and they showed no ill effects. He even used it as a surface dressing for infected wounds and as a lotion for eye infections in a few patients at St. Mary's, with some promising but inconclusive results. The great dream, of course, was to inject penicillin into the bloodstream to fight a systemic infection. But for that, he needed a pure, concentrated, and stable form of the drug. And this is where he hit a wall. Fleming was a bacteriologist, not a biochemist. The task of isolating the single active ingredient from the complex soup of the mold broth was beyond his skills and the capabilities of his laboratory. He assigned the task to two young researchers in his department, but they struggled. Penicillin proved to be an incredibly fragile and unstable molecule. It lost its potency quickly when exposed to changes in temperature or acidity. Every attempt they made to purify it resulted in the substance breaking down and losing its antibacterial power. Fleming tried to generate interest in his discovery within the wider scientific community. His 1929 paper on the antibacterial action of cultures of Penicillium was published in the British Journal of Experimental Pathology. It laid out his findings clearly, but it failed to make a significant impact. It was read by other bacteriologists who might have found it useful as a laboratory tool, but the chemists and pharmacologists who might have been able to purify it largely ignored it. Fleming himself, while convinced of penicillin's potential, was not a particularly dynamic or persuasive public speaker. He gave a few lectures on the topic, but his understated presentation style failed to ignite the excitement and investment needed to push the research forward. Frustrated by the chemical challenges and with other research interests to pursue, Fleming eventually moved on. For the next decade, the story of penicillin entered a period of dormancy. The discovery languished. Fleming continued to maintain his original strain of the mold, sharing it with other researchers who requested it, but its use was confined to a few laboratories as a specialized tool for culturing bacteria. The miracle cure sat on a shelf, a forgotten curiosity. The world, still plagued by bacterial disease, was unaware of how close it had come to a revolution. The clear zone on the petri dish remained a tantalizing but unfulfilled promise. A second and very different team of scientists would be needed to pick up the trail that Fleming had lost. Chapter 7. A New Hope in Oxford. For nearly 10 years after Fleming's initial publication, penicillin remained a footnote in the scientific literature. The revolution it promised was stalled. The story now shifts from London to the ancient university city of Oxford. and to a team of researchers with a very different set of skills and a far more determined approach. The leader of this team was an Australian pathologist named Howard Florey. Florey was the polar opposite of Fleming in temperament. He was a driven, ambitious, and sometimes abrasive leader, a brilliant organizer and a tireless researcher who was determined to make a major impact in the field of medicine. In 1935, he became the professor of pathology at the Sir William Dunn School of Pathology at Oxford, where he assembled a formidable team of scientists. One of his key recruits was a German Jewish biochemist named Ernst Boris Chain. Chain was a refugee from Nazi Germany, a brilliant, passionate, and often volatile young scientist with a prodigious intellect. He was an expert in enzymes, and it was this expertise that would inadvertently lead the Oxford team back to Fleming's forgotten discovery. In 1938, Florey and Chain decided to undertake a systematic survey of natural antibacterial substances. They were not initially interested in finding a therapeutic drug. Theirs was a purely academic project, aimed at understanding the complex chemical warfare that takes place between different microorganisms in nature. Chain began an exhaustive search of the scientific literature for any documented examples of one microbe killing another. He stumbled upon Fleming's 1929 paper on penicillin. Chain was intrigued. Fleming had described a substance that dissolved bacteria, which sounded very much like an enzyme, Chain's area of specialty. He showed the paper to Florey, who was also intrigued, particularly by Fleming's observation that penicillin seemed to be harmless to animal cells. Florey, a pathologist, immediately grasped the therapeutic potential of such a substance. Despite the immense challenges that had thwarted Fleming, Florey decided to make the isolation and investigation of penicillin a major project for his department. It was a risky bet. The world was on the brink of war, and resources were scarce. Pursuing a substance that had been abandoned for a decade was a bold move. Florey assembled a dedicated team to tackle the problem. In addition to Chain, who would lead the biochemical work, he brought in a quiet, ingenious biologist named Norman Heatley. Heatley was a master of experimental design and improvisation, a practical genius who could build the complex apparatus needed for the delicate work of extraction and purification from scratch. The team began their work in late 1938 in the cramped and poorly funded labs of the Dunn School. Their first task was to acquire a sample of Fleming's original mold. They managed to obtain a culture from a colleague who had once gotten it from Fleming. Their next challenge was to grow the mold in sufficient quantities to produce enough of the raw juice to work with. This was a painstaking process. The mold grew only as a thin layer on the surface of a liquid culture medium. The team had to use any flat, shallow vessel they could find to maximize the surface area. They began with a few flasks, but soon the lab was filled with hundreds, and eventually thousands, of specially designed ceramic pots, which resembled hospital bedpans, each one carefully inoculated with the penicillium spores and left to incubate for a week or two. The work was slow, tedious, and prone to contamination, but slowly, drip by drip, they began to accumulate the raw material they would need to attempt the purification process that had defeated Fleming a decade earlier. The forgotten promise of penicillin was about to be reawakened. Chapter 8. The Kitchen Chemists of Oxford. The challenge facing the Oxford team was immense. They needed to extract a tiny amount of an incredibly unstable chemical from a large volume of liquid. It was, as Chain described, like trying to extract a single lump of sugar from a ton of sand. The initial attempts were fraught with failure. Chain's first efforts to purify the penicillin using traditional chemical methods resulted in the same outcome Fleming had experienced. The fragile molecule broke down and lost its power. It was here that Norman Heatley's practical ingenuity became the key to the entire project. Heatley realized that the problem was one of chemistry and engineering. He devised a clever new method for extraction called counter-current extraction. It was based on the principle that penicillin would dissolve in certain organic solvents, like ether or amyl acetate, but only at a specific controlled acidity. Heatley designed and built a complex apparatus out of glass tubing. In this system, the acidic mold juice would flow in one direction, while the organic solvent flowed in the opposite direction. The penicillin would pass from the water-based broth into the solvent. Then, by changing the acidity again, he could transfer the penicillin back into a much smaller volume of pure water, achieving a significant concentration. This process was delicate, dangerous, and physically demanding. Ether is highly flammable, and the team was working in a lab with open flames. The entire building could have exploded at any moment. The process was also incredibly inefficient. They had to process hundreds of liters of mold juice to produce a tiny speck of a brownish, impure powder. To scale up production, the team became masters of improvisation. They couldn't get enough laboratory flasks, so they commissioned a local pottery works in Stoke-on-Trent to manufacture 600 custom-designed, stackable ceramic vessels that looked like a cross between a bedpan and a pie dish. The entire Dunn School was essentially turned into a penicillin factory. The corridors were lined with these vessels, each one containing a precious, growing layer of bluish-green mold. The work was back-breaking and relentless. The Penicillin Girls, a group of women hired to assist with the project, spent their days inoculating the vessels, harvesting the mold juice, and managing the extraction process. The atmosphere in the lab was a strange mixture of a scientific laboratory, a brewery, and a dairy, with a constant clanking of bottles and the distinctive, musty smell of the mold. As the Blitz raged over Britain in 1940, the team worked under constant threat of bombing raids. They knew they were working on something potentially vital for the war effort. Florey, ever the pragmatist, made sure that he, Chain, and Heatley all rubbed spores of the penicillium mold into the linings of their coat pockets, so that if the lab were destroyed and they survived, they could restart their work from scratch. After months of this grueling, low-tech, industrial-scale kitchen chemistry, they finally managed to produce enough of the impure, brownish penicillin powder to conduct the experiment that would determine the future of the project. They had shown it worked in a test tube, just as Fleming had. Now they needed to know if it could fight an infection inside a living animal. The fate of the entire enterprise would come down to a small group of laboratory mice. Chapter 9. The Decisive Mouse Test. On Saturday, May 25, 1940, the world outside the Dunn School of Pathology was in turmoil. The British Army was in full retreat across France, falling back to the beaches of Dunkirk. The threat of a German invasion of Britain seemed imminent. Inside the laboratory, however, Florey and his team were preparing for a different kind of battle, one that would be fought on a microscopic scale within the bodies of 8 small, white mice. This experiment, designed by Florey and executed with meticulous care, would be the ultimate test of penicillin. It would determine whether it was merely a laboratory curiosity or a life-saving drug. The plan was simple and stark. The 8 mice were first injected with a lethal dose of virulent streptococci bacteria, a dose that the team knew from previous experiments was certain to kill them within 24 hours. A few hours later, as the mice began to show signs of sickness, their fur ruffling and their bodies becoming listless, the intervention began. 4 of the mice were set aside as a control group. They would receive no treatment. Their fate was sealed. They were the benchmark against which any success would be measured. The other 4 mice, the test group, began to receive injections of the team's precious, hard-won penicillin extract. The dose was tiny, a fraction of a milligram, administered every 3 hours. The supply of the brown powder was so small that this was all they could afford to use. The team, exhausted from months of relentless work, settled in for an all-night vigil. They watched the mice, their hopes and the future of medicine resting on the survival of these 4 small creatures. As the night wore on, the grim, predictable course of the infection began to unfold in the control group. One by one, the 4 untreated mice grew weaker, sicker, and then died. The atmosphere in the lab was thick with tension and anticipation. Then, they turned their attention to the test group. The difference was astounding. The 4 mice that had been receiving the penicillin injections were not just surviving, they were recovering. By the next morning, as the sun rose on a world at war, the 4 control mice were dead, while the 4 treated mice were alive, active, and appeared to be in perfect health. Ernst Chain, in his characteristic emotional way, later described the scene as a miracle. The result was unambiguous. Penicillin worked. It was not just a bacteriostatic agent that stopped bacteria from growing. It was a bactericidal agent that allowed the body's own immune system to kill them. And it did so inside a living body, with no apparent toxic effects. For the first time, they had definitive proof that Fleming's mold juice was a potent, life-saving chemotherapeutic agent. This single, elegant experiment was the turning point in the history of medicine. It marked the moment when the promise first seen on Fleming's Petri dish 12 years earlier was finally validated. The Oxford team now knew they held in their hands a drug with the potential to save millions of lives. But they also faced a new and even more daunting problem. The mouse test had used up nearly their entire supply of penicillin. To treat a single human being would require hundreds of times more. The challenge had now shifted from the laboratory bench to the monumental task of industrial-scale production. Chapter 10. The First Human Trial, a Tragic Triumph. Buoyed by the success of the mouse experiment, the Oxford team redoubled their efforts to produce more penicillin. The entire laboratory was now a frantic, cottage industry-style factory. Every available space was filled with the now famous bedpan-like vessels, and the extraction process ran day and night. Their goal was to produce enough of the drug to conduct the first human trial. By early 1941, after months of exhausting work, they had accumulated what they believed was a sufficient quantity. Their first patient was a 43-year-old police constable named Albert Alexander. A few months earlier, while pruning roses in his garden, he had sustained a small scratch at the corner of his mouth from a thorn. The tiny wound had become infected with both staphylococci and streptococci. By the time he was admitted to the Radcliffe Infirmary in Oxford, the infection had run rampant. His entire face was covered in weeping, suppurating abscesses. He had lost an eye, and the infection had spread to his lungs and his bones. He was dying a slow, agonizing death from septicemia, and all conventional treatments had failed. He was the perfect candidate for a compassionate trial of this new, experimental drug. On February 12, 1941, Albert Alexander was given his first injection of penicillin. He was given an initial dose of 200 milligrams, followed by smaller doses every 3 hours. The effect was nothing short of miraculous. Within 24 hours, his fever began to drop. The abscesses started to heal and recede. His appetite returned. He was, by all accounts, making a stunning recovery. The Oxford team was jubilant. Their drug, produced in their makeshift lab, was saving a man from certain death. But their jubilation was soon tempered by a terrifying problem. They were running out of penicillin. A human body is vastly larger than a mouse, and the infection was deeply entrenched. Constable Alexander required huge doses of the drug. The team's entire stockpile, the result of months of back-breaking labor, was being used up at an alarming rate. In a desperate attempt to conserve their precious supply, they came up with an ingenious but grim solution. They knew that about half of the penicillin administered was excreted, unchanged, in the patient's urine. So they began a recycling program. Norman Heatley would collect Alexander's urine each day, rush it back to the lab on his bicycle, and work through the night to re-extract the precious penicillin from it, so it could be re-administered to the patient the next day. For 5 days, this cycle continued, and Alexander's condition continued to improve dramatically. But they were fighting a losing battle against simple mathematics. Despite the recycling, they were using up the drug faster than they could produce it or reclaim it. On the 5th day, the supply ran out completely. Without the penicillin to hold the bacteria at bay, the infection, which had been suppressed but not completely eradicated, came roaring back. Albert Alexander relapsed. His fever returned, and the abscesses began to spread once more. A few weeks later, he died. The first human trial of penicillin was both a spectacular triumph and a heartbreaking tragedy. It had demonstrated beyond any doubt the astonishing power of the drug to cure a fatal infection in a human being. But it had also laid bare the single greatest obstacle to its use, the problem of supply. Florey and his team had proven the concept, but they knew they could never produce enough penicillin in their university laboratory to meet the potential demand. To turn penicillin from an experimental drug into a global medicine, they would need the industrial might of a nation that was not, at that moment, being bombed every night. Their gaze turned westward, across the Atlantic, to the United States of America. Chapter 11. The Secret Mission to America. By the summer of 1941, Britain was standing alone against the might of Nazi Germany. The nation's industrial capacity was entirely dedicated to the war effort, building planes, ships, and munitions. There was simply no spare capacity, no steel for fermentation tanks, no factory space, and no manpower to embark on a massive and unproven new pharmaceutical project. Howard Florey knew that if penicillin was ever going to be produced on a scale large enough to make a difference, he would have to seek help elsewhere. He set his sights on the United States, which was not yet in the war, and possessed the vast, untouched industrial and scientific resources needed for the task. In June of 1941, Florey and his quiet but indispensable colleague Norman Heatley embarked on a secret and vital mission. They were traveling as representatives of the Rockefeller Foundation, which had funded some of their research, a cover that masked the true, urgent purpose of their trip. Their luggage was modest, but they carried with them their most precious possession: the live-in source of penicillin, a small amount of the Penicillium notatum mold, carefully preserved and, as an extra precaution, smeared onto the linings of their coats. They arrived in a hot, humid Washington, D.C. in July and began the arduous process of trying to convince the American scientific establishment and pharmaceutical industry to take on their project. Their first meetings were not encouraging. They were met with skepticism and a degree of professional rivalry. The major American pharmaceutical companies like Merck, Squibb, and Pfizer were intrigued but cautious. The process the Oxford team described, growing a mold on the surface of a liquid in thousands of small bottles, seemed hopelessly inefficient and commercially unviable. They were also more interested in the idea of synthesizing penicillin chemically, which they believed would be a more profitable long-term strategy, though this would ultimately prove to be an immensely difficult task that would not be achieved for many years. Florey and Heatley needed a champion, someone who could open doors and marshal the necessary resources. They found that champion in Dr. Charles Thom, a principal mycologist at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Thom was the world's leading expert on the penicillium mold. In fact, he was the very scientist who had first identified the species of the mold on Fleming's original plate. Thom immediately recognized the importance of their work and directed them to the Department of Agriculture's Northern Regional Research Laboratory, NRRL, in Peoria, Illinois. This lab had a world-class team of fermentation experts, chemists, and engineers whose primary mission was to find new industrial uses for agricultural products, particularly corn. The lab in Peoria had been experimenting with a process called submerged fermentation, or deep tank fermentation, for producing other chemicals. This technique involved growing a microorganism not on the surface of a liquid, but fully submerged within a huge, aerated vat of nutrient broth. If they could get the penicillium mold to grow this way, it would be a game changer, allowing for production on a truly massive industrial scale. The team at Peoria, led by Dr. Robert Coghill, agreed to take on the project with enthusiasm. Norman Heatley, with his quiet expertise, decided to stay behind in Peoria for several months to work alongside the American scientists, sharing his knowledge of the delicate extraction process. The arrival of the two British scientists, with their moldy coats and their incredible story, had planted a seed in the fertile ground of American industry. That seed was about to grow, nurtured by the urgency of a world at war. Chapter 12. The Peoria Project and the Cantaloupe Mold. The collaboration at the Northern Regional Research Laboratory in Peoria became the turning point in the race to mass-produce penicillin. The American team, working with Norman Heatley, attacked the problem with a combination of scientific rigor and Midwestern practicality. Their first challenge was to find a better food for the mold, a more effective culture medium that would encourage it to produce more penicillin. They experimented with hundreds of different substances and found, much to their surprise, that the most effective additive was corn steep liquor, a thick, syrupy byproduct of the corn wet milling process, which was available in vast quantities in Peoria. Adding corn steep liquor and lactose to the broth resulted in a tenfold increase in the yield of penicillin. Their second and more significant challenge was to find a better strain of the mold itself. Fleming's original Penicillium notatum was a poor producer. It yielded only a tiny amount of penicillin, and it would only grow on the surface of the broth, making it unsuitable for the deep tank fermentation that was the key to industrial production. A worldwide search for a super mold began. Soil samples were collected from airfields and exotic locations all over the globe and sent to Peoria for testing. The U.S. Army Air Corps was instructed to bring back soil from wherever they landed. But the breakthrough came not from some distant exotic land, but from a local grocery store in Peoria. In the summer of 1943, a lab technician at the NRRL, Mary Hunt, earned the nickname Moldy Mary for her diligence in searching for promising-looking molds on spoiled food from the local markets. One day, she brought in a cantaloupe that was covered with a pretty, golden-green, velvety mold. When the scientists cultured this new mold, they were astounded. This new strain, identified as Penicillium chrysogenum, produced over 200 times more penicillin than Fleming's original strain. Furthermore, when exposed to X-rays and UV light to induce mutations, the scientists at another lab were able to create even more productive versions. A descendant of the mold found on that single Peoria cantaloupe became the ancestor of virtually all the penicillin produced in the world, then and now. With a better nutrient medium and a super-productive mold, the final piece of the puzzle was perfecting the deep tank fermentation process. This was a major engineering challenge. The mold needed a constant, sterile supply of air bubbled through the tank, and the broth had to be constantly agitated, all without introducing any contaminating bacteria, which would ruin the entire batch. Working with pharmaceutical giants like Pfizer, which had expertise in fermentation from producing citric acid, the engineers gradually solved these problems. They moved from small laboratory flasks to pilot tanks, and then to massive 2-story high fermentation vats, each holding thousands of gallons of bubbling, fermenting corn steep liquor. The United States' entry into World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 added a desperate urgency to the project. Penicillin was no longer just a promising medicine. It was a strategic national priority. The U.S. government established a civilian agency, the War Production Board, to coordinate a massive nationwide effort, involving over 20 different companies to scale up production. What had begun as a serendipitous observation in a cluttered London lab had become a vast, state-sponsored, industrial enterprise, a crucial part of the Allied war effort. Chapter 13. The Miracle Drug of World War II. By 1943, the monumental effort to mass-produce penicillin began to pay off. The first batches of the new drug were strictly reserved for the military. The impact on the battlefields of World War II was immediate and profound. For the first time in the history of warfare, A soldier wounded in combat had a better than even chance of surviving a major infection. Medics, equipped with vials of the yellow penicillin powder, could treat wounds on the front lines, preventing the onset of gas gangrene and other deadly infections that had killed so many in the previous war. In field hospitals, surgeons could now perform operations with a new sense of confidence, knowing they had a powerful weapon to combat the post-operative infections that had once been their greatest fear. The results were plain to see in the mortality statistics. In World War I, the death rate from bacterial pneumonia in the U.S. Army was 18%. In World War II, thanks to penicillin, it fell to less than 1%. The drug was not only saving lives, but also saving limbs, drastically reducing the number of amputations required for infected wounds. Stories of its miraculous effects spread rapidly, and penicillin became a symbol of hope and of Allied scientific and industrial supremacy. Journalists wrote glowing articles hailing it as a miracle drug, and soldiers wrote home with awe-filled accounts of its power. Penicillin was not only used for wound infections. It was also incredibly effective against a host of other diseases that plagued soldiers in close quarters, such as strep throat, scarlet fever, and, crucially, venereal diseases like gonorrhea and syphilis, which had historically been a major cause of soldiers being removed from active duty. The ability to quickly cure these diseases and return soldiers to the front was a significant strategic advantage. One of the largest single uses of penicillin during the war was in preparation for the D-Day landings in Normandy in June 1944. The Allied command knew that the invasion would result in massive casualties, and they stockpiled vast quantities of the drug. Enough penicillin was produced to treat every single anticipated casualty, a logistical feat that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. This stockpile undoubtedly saved thousands of lives in the bloody days and weeks following the invasion. While production was initially reserved for the military, a small amount was made available for civilian use in exceptional cases, and the stories from the home front were just as dramatic. Children dying of meningitis made astonishing recoveries. People on the brink of death from pneumonia were brought back to life. In 1942, a woman named Ann Miller in a New Haven hospital was dying of a streptococcal infection following a miscarriage. She was in a coma, her temperature over 107 degrees, and had been given her last rites. As a last resort, her doctors managed to obtain a tiny amount of the experimental penicillin. After a series of injections, her fever broke, and she made a full recovery. She would live until the age of 90. Her case, widely publicized, helped to galvanize public and governmental support for the penicillin project. By the end of the war, in 1945, American factories were producing over 650 billion units of penicillin a month. The price had plummeted, and the drug was becoming widely available to the civilian population. The war, for all its horror, had acted as a powerful catalyst, compressing what might have been decades of development into just a few short years, and delivering the miracle drug to the world. Chapter 14. A World Transformed and the Nobel Prize. The end of the Second World War marked the beginning of a new age in medicine, the antibiotic age. Penicillin was the vanguard of a revolution that would fundamentally transform human health and society. In October 1945, as the world was emerging from the conflict, The Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine was awarded jointly to the three men whose work had bookended the discovery: Sir Alexander Fleming, for his initial observation, and Sir Howard Florey and Ernst Boris Chain, for their rediscovery and development of the drug. In his acceptance speech, Fleming, with characteristic foresight, issued a warning. He spoke of the danger that bacteria could develop resistance to penicillin if the drug was used improperly or in doses that were too small. It was a remarkably prescient warning about a problem that would come to define the future of the antibiotic era. In the post-war years, penicillin became widely available to the public, and its impact was felt in every corner of society. Diseases that had been terrifying and often fatal scourges for centuries were suddenly rendered treatable. Pneumonia, scarlet fever, rheumatic fever, diphtheria, syphilis, gonorrhea, all could be conquered by a course of injections. Life expectancy, which had been creeping up slowly for decades, began to soar. Infant and child mortality rates plummeted. Childbirth became dramatically safer for mothers. The very practice of medicine was transformed. With the threat of bacterial infection largely neutralized, surgeons could dare to perform operations of incredible complexity that would have been unthinkable just a decade earlier. Open-heart surgery, organ transplants, joint replacements, and extensive cancer surgeries all became possible because of the safety net provided by antibiotics. Penicillin had not just cured diseases, it had enabled the birth of modern, high-tech medicine. The success of penicillin also ignited a gold rush in the pharmaceutical industry to find other antibiotics. Researchers now knew that microorganisms in the soil were engaged in constant chemical warfare, and they began a systematic search for other antibiotic-producing microbes. This led to a golden age of antibiotic discovery. In 1943, Selman Waksman, a soil microbiologist at Rutgers University, discovered streptomycin, the first effective treatment for tuberculosis, a disease that had killed billions throughout history. In the following years, new classes of antibiotics were discovered in quick succession: chloramphenicol, the tetracyclines, erythromycin, and many more. Each new discovery expanded the arsenal of medicine, providing weapons against an ever wider range of bacterial pathogens. The world was remade. The fear of infection that had haunted humanity for its entire existence began to recede. A sense of medical optimism, almost hubris, took hold. It seemed as though humanity had finally won the ancient war against pestilence. For a few brief decades, it felt as if the era of infectious disease was coming to an end. Chapter 15: An Enduring Legacy and a New Challenge. The legacy of the discovery of penicillin is almost impossible to overstate. It is a story that encapsulates the best of science. The prepared mind of Alexander Fleming noticing an anomaly, the dogged determination of Florey and his Oxford team, the massive industrial collaboration that scaled up production, and the countless lives saved as a result. Penicillin and the antibiotics that followed it are one of the great triumphs of human ingenuity, a testament to our ability to understand and manipulate the natural world for our own benefit. It has added an estimated 20 years to the average human lifespan and has saved, by conservative estimates, well over 200 million lives. Without it, our modern world would be unrecognizable. We have built our entire medical system upon the foundation that it laid. But the story does not end with a simple, triumphant victory. The war against bacteria is not over. Fleming's prophetic warning at his Nobel ceremony has come to pass with a vengeance. Bacteria are living organisms, and like all living things, they evolve. The widespread use and overuse of antibiotics over the past 70 years has created immense selective pressure on bacterial populations. Any bacterium that, by random mutation, develops a mechanism to resist the effects of an antibiotic will survive and reproduce, passing on its resistance genes. This process of natural selection has led to the emergence of superbugs, strains of bacteria that are resistant to multiple and in some cases all of our available antibiotics. Infections like MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, and multi-drug-resistant tuberculosis are becoming increasingly common and are posing a grave new threat to global health. The pipeline of new antibiotics has also slowed to a trickle, as the scientific and economic challenges of discovering new drugs have grown. We are now facing the frightening possibility of a post-antibiotic era, a time when common infections could once again become untreatable, and the routine medical procedures we take for granted could become lethally dangerous. The battle that began in Fleming's lab continues today in research centers and hospitals all over the world. The legacy of penicillin is therefore a dual one. It is a legacy of lives saved and a world transformed. But it is also a cautionary tale about the delicate balance between humanity and the microbial world. It reminds us that our victories are never permanent and that the invisible enemy is constantly adapting. And so, as our story comes to a close, let the image of that small, clear circle on a forgotten petri dish settle in your mind. A moment of accidental grace that bent the arc of human history. Let the long, quiet story of its journey from a London lab to an Oxford factory, to the battlefields of the world and into our modern lives, be a gentle weight that helps you drift away. There's nothing more to consider now. The battle against the unseen world will continue, but for tonight your part is simply to rest, to breathe in and to breathe out, and to fall into a deep and peaceful sleep. Good night.